President David, Rotarians, guests, I'm well aware that Australian lingua is a derivative language. There is no need to reinforce it at each meeting. It gives me great pleasure and delight to introduce Dr. Sherry Kothari. We hear the Premier every day talk about our economy transitioning from the old economics of manufacturing to the smart new economics of innovative production. Well, today we have before us somebody who actually does it. In your bulletin, you have a little bio about Sherry. She's the Chief Executive and Managing Director of the CRC for Cell Therapy Manufacturing. This is a $60 million not-for-profit initiative bringing together industry and academics. Sherry has been a founder, investor in 2 other successful life sciences spin-offs, so she knows how to do it. But before that, she was actually in maxillofacial surgery. So, are you also a dentist? Yes. Oh, yes. And she has a passion for entrepreneurship and translation within the biotechnology sector, and translation within. She has established strategic partnerships in knowledge across Australia, Asia and Europe, and she has recently won Women in Innovation South Australia Award in Science and Health. Sherry, we are delighted to have you here today, and we look forward to hearing what you have to share with us.
Thank you very much.
It's now over to you.
Thank you very much, Frank. Thank you for that very warm welcome. And thank you all for giving me this opportunity to speak to you today. So this is where we check and see whether technology works. So as Frank said, I'm going to talk to you today about cell therapy and cell therapy manufacturing and what we are trying to do in growing this industry in Australia. No, it's not working. Nope. Oh, there we go. I'm just going to start with a quick video clip. Yes, I thought that wouldn't need much introduction. As you can see, even decades ago, we had a penchant for trying to rebuild the body. All that has happened in the last sort of 40, 50 decades is we've moved and the focus has shifted from robotics and electronics to now looking at cells and looking at how we use our own healing powers and how we harness those. This shift in focus has been brought about by an unprecedented move in our demographic situation. And this slide actually makes for some scary viewing in my opinion. If you look at that very first box on the left there, this is what it was like in the 1920s the right way round, a good little pyramid where we had greater numbers of people under the age of 40, 45 than we did over. And we can see that at 80 we've got a fine peak. As we move into the 2000s, we see this shift where we now have a growing number of people over the age of 45. It gives a new meaning to the term middle-age spread. As we project to 2045, we get this very sinister coffin shape. And that's because the number of people now over the age of 65 is growing at an alarming rate. And this has a serious impact for the world as a whole. It means that we live under very pressured times. Our healthcare budget is under enormous strain. 3-4 years ago, in 2011, the first of the baby boomer generation turned 65. Today, there are about 3 million people in Australia alone over the age of 65 and growing. One unfortunate consequence of this is that there is a rise in chronic diseases and chronic conditions. And today, globally, about 80% of healthcare budgets are actually spent trying to treat chronic diseases. So if we project forward in about 20, 30 years' time, the only budget anyone will be interested in will be the health budget. So this is where cell therapies comes in. So what is cell therapy? Cell therapy, put very simply, is the use of human living cells to repair, replace, or regenerate diseased or damaged tissue. This could be diseased tissue, it could be tissue that is just aging as part of the normal aging process. But this is how we try and harness the body's own healing potential by using cells. This is probably the fastest growing sector in regenerative medicine today globally. And one of the reasons for this is that pharmaceuticals have had their day. We're starting to see prohibitive costs in the development of new drugs. We're starting to see drugs actually come to the end of their development life cycles and increasing costs. And because of all this, we need to find other ways to look at treating conditions. The one significant potential cell therapy has over traditional pharmaceutical-based medicines is the potential to cure and not just manage. So what is cell therapy manufacturing? Well, one very good example of a cell therapy that has been around for a number of decades is bone marrow transplants. This was probably what we would call a first-generation cell therapy, where the focus was on actually just replacing damaged cells. And you're all familiar with bone marrow transplants. But the problem with something like this is that there are still significant challenges, and the potential is still very limited to being able to treat only a very small number of conditions. So the shift in looking at cell therapies has been brought about because of research in cell and molecular biology over the last 10, 20 years, where we have a whole host of new types of cells that have been discovered, which have actually allowed us to start working with a whole array of different cell types. And these are you will all have heard about stem cells. One of the advantages of stem cells is that they have the potential to turn into any other cell type in the body. So we can program a stem cell, we can work with it and make it go down a certain pathway and turn it into a different cell type. So there are cells that we work with that have the potential to repair. There are cells that so one of the other cell types we work with are islet cells. These are the cells in the body that produce insulin. So this is for the treatment of diabetes. There are cells that can make new blood vessels, and there are cells that help with our immune system. And between these new cell types, and this is just, this is a few of them, by no means a comprehensive list, but between them, we have the potential to look at cell therapies for pretty much any clinical condition you'd care to name. And today, somewhere in the world, there is a cell therapy being developed for pretty much any clinical condition. And, this is just a small range here. Currently, there are cell therapies for orthopedic defects, for immune diseases, for cancers, for skin conditions. Today, there are therapies being looked at for things like Parkinson's and stroke, and, of course, for diabetes and chronic wounds. So cell therapy manufacturing, why have we created this CRC to look at something like this? Well, if you think about what it might take to take a promising cell that's got therapeutic potential and turn it into a therapy, it's a long and arduous journey, just as it would be with drug development. We first have to find the right cell type. So if you imagine taking a vial of blood that has a mixed population of cells, through that, we actually have to identify the right cell type. So that you have to isolate that cell. Once you've isolated it, you have to actually run a whole series of rigorous tests to show that it is indeed the cell type you claim it is. And from a regulatory perspective, this is all going to go back into humans, so there has to be a lot of rigor, just as with drugs. Once you've identified and isolated that cell type, what you get in a 20 ml vial is going to be nowhere enough to actually deliver as a therapy to patients. So you have to then actually grow these cells up in significant numbers. So we're talking about taking a few thousand cells and growing them up into tens and hundreds of millions, if not billions of cells. That process alone can take anywhere from 10 days to 3 weeks, depending on the cell type. And that is actually looking after that cell in a laboratory setting 24 hours of the day. So there's a significant resource that goes into this. When you've gone to all that trouble, you then want to make sure you store them properly. So a lot of the time you look at freezing methods and because you want to be able to retrieve those batches for future treatments, you have to find appropriate ways of storing them. So this is all part of that manufacturing process, but then you can only go so far in a laboratory. You then have to take it through what we call GMP manufacture, good manufacturing practice, where everything has to be done in clean rooms under sterile conditions. And that again adds a significant resource and cost to it, as well as time. And then, of course, by the time you've done all that, you want to make sure that you deliver that very expensive product in an efficient way. And just one example, we currently work with Islet Cells for the treatment of type 1 diabetes in patients. Those islet cells go through this expensive process of retrieval. They are then delivered by injection into a vein, which is a very unsophisticated way of delivering a very precious cell, because it's blind, you can't really see where they're going, and you just hope that you're getting them in the right spot, that they will get there, they will stick there, and they will do what they're supposed to do. So we are looking at efficient ways to deliver things as well. Significant challenges remain for this industry. It is a young industry, but it is, as I said, rapidly growing. Last year, it was valued at about $34 billion. So it is growing very significantly. But cost is going to remain a huge challenge, as will the regulatory hurdles and the infrastructure. So our vision as a CRC is to actually help address some of those challenges and facilitate the translation of these therapies, taking them and crossing that, what we call that valley of death, So taking something that has been developed up to a certain point in the laboratory, but before you've got your significant investor coming in and pouring in lots of money, there is that valley of death. We need to be able to cross that. We need to be able to take things to the next stage to show proof of concept. And that's what we try and do. We want to make cell therapies affordable and accessible to the population at large. And to give you an example, in the last couple of years, there have been some very significant developments in the US with cell therapy treatments for cancer, where they've treated certain leukemias in children, and these kids with absolutely no hope have gone into remission. But at the moment, those therapies cost in the hundreds of thousands per patient. And our aim is to try and work with the processes and the manufacturing to make sure that we can bring those costs down. We work with 15 partners. So the CRC scheme is a federally funded government scheme that was set up 20 years ago, designed to bring together academic researchers with industry to tackle problems of social, economic and environmental importance in Australia. So we are a CRC that was set up, we've been operating just over 2 years now. We have 15 partners that comprise universities, so research providers, as well as hospitals and clinics and charities, and of course industry partners. We even have 2 US-based companies as part of our industry partnership. And together, what we do is a fairly unique approach in that we have actually brought together under one roof not just cell and molecular biologists and clinicians and industry players, but we are bringing a multidisciplinary approach to this. So we are working with materials scientists, probably some of the best in the world, to actually take what is already, materials that are already there and processes that exist currently, which are being used for the cell therapy industry but weren't developed for the cell therapy industry. And we're using some of our materials technologies to actually optimize what's already out there. And by doing that, we're able to actually make things more efficient and bring costs down. So I'm just going to give you one very quick example of a therapy we are currently working on, and how by doing this under the auspices of the CRC and bringing in multidisciplinary groups together, how we can hopefully fast track the development of something into the clinic. So this is an example, and I must apologise. This is not very well timed. You've just had your lunch, so I do apologise. But one of the things we're looking at is a treatment for diabetic foot ulcers. Chronic wounds are a huge, huge burden. They're a silent epidemic in Australia. About 400,000 Australians will suffer from a chronic wound at any given time. It costs, in direct costs alone, it costs $3 billion a year for the treatment of chronic wounds. And some wounds, of course, are life-threatening. So they are a huge problem. And because you tend to see them predominantly in the elderly, they're not a very sexy subject. People don't talk about them. But nevertheless, they are a huge burden. So, and at any point, somebody somewhere will have come across somebody with diabetes who has had some sort of chronic wound. And the thing about some of these wounds, particularly the ischemic foot wounds, is that often you can't treat them. There is no treatment for these wounds, and they often lead to amputation. There is globally an amputation through an ischemic limb or a diabetic foot wound every 30 seconds globally. And in Australia alone, just under 4,000 amputations a year. So that's significant, because when you think of all the indirect consequences and impacts of something like this, it's not just the cost, but it's the quality of life that is also affected. So one of the treatments we are working on, and this The images I'm going to show you are something that actually has been developed and has worked, but it worked in a bespoke fashion. So we had a diabetic foot ulcer on a patient that had remained unhealed for about 3.5 years. It just did not heal with conventional treatment. We developed a bandage, and you can see in the middle there, a very thin polymer sheet that has got skin cells growing on it. Now, these are the patient's own skin cells that were taken from a biopsy. And after 8 deliveries to that wound, after 3.5 years of that wound not healing, within 8 weeks it had healed and it remained healed. So that is the potential of cell therapies. What we're looking at today, this was done about 20 years ago in the United Kingdom. What we're doing here today is we're using that same principle and those technologies, but rather than using the patient's own cells, we are looking at cells that are mass-produced, that are a sort of stem cell. So we don't have the need to be bespoke, because that means the treatment's only available for few patients and it's very expensive. By mass producing or using cell banks, we can actually turn this into a therapy that becomes accessible to a lot more patients. And as I said, our focus is really on translation. So we have GMP manufacturing or pilot manufacturing facilities out at Mawson Lakes. And the idea is, as we take these projects through, like this patch for wounds, for example, we have the ability then to take it through these facilities and be able to do phase 1 or early proof of concept trials in patients here in Adelaide. And as part of this, we have a very significant education and training element. This is a new industry globally, and we know in 5 years' time, there's just not going to be enough qualified people for this industry. So we have actually established a training program with PhD students, which we are hoping to widen out to staff and technologists as well, where we actually not only teach them about the biotech industry and cell therapy in detail, but we are actually embedding entrepreneurial learning into that PhD. And we've just, I'm pleased to say, completed our first entrepreneurship module with our PhD students, and it was an absolute runaway success. So that's it. Hopefully that gives you a snapshot of cell therapies and what we're trying to do. Thank you.
That was inspiring and perfectly timed for the time slot. We have time for 1 or 2 questions. Adri, you had your hand up first.
Thank you so much for this presentation. How important is genetic compatibility in coming up with a best approach towards regeneration?
So I think as far as cell therapies is concerned, there are 2 types of cell therapies being developed. One is what we call an autologous therapy, where you use the patient's own cells, in which case it isn't really much of an issue. The other one is an allogeneic therapy, where you're trying to bank cells, or you have a single source and you grow them up. And they go through the usual, sort of HLA testing and matching that you would go through with any sort of human tissue. So, but it's not something that we would consider a significant problem, and that's the advantage of using stem cells. Yeah.
Pardon my ignorance on this front, but are you replicating cells, or are you actually tweaking them on the way? Sorry, that's probably a simplistic question.
No, that's actually a very good question. There's no simple answer to that. It depends who you ask. So I would say that a lot of the time we are replicating cells. The regulatory authorities would argue and say that at the minute you actually take a cell out of the body and you grow it up from 1 to 10, you are actually tweaking them. So it just depends, but it's actually a good question, and it's something that the jury's still out on as to what would be manipulation, because there is genetic manipulation as well, so there are gene therapies going on as well. Yeah.
Last one.
Yes, thank you. That was fascinating. This is not a religious question, but I have a question about the extent to which the continual chasing of longevity is actually a tale which we are never going to catch.
Yes, so I think that's a moral debate, and we could go on forever. I think we can't ignore the fact that we've got an aging population, and that aging population still demands a certain quality of life. And so I think part of this is to actually provide that quality of life for those patients who are aging.
Ultimately, it'll be a political question. How much is society willing to pay? And that will then intersect with ethics. So, there's hundreds of hands up, but the time is up. Thank you, Sherry, for a real insight into what's happening in South Australia. This is very exciting. We all are depressed about our manufacturing industries, but I think this is the future. And so we thank you very much for sharing what's happening. And the Rotary Club of Adelaide actually believes in true and tried technology, so your future is tied up with a rotary pen.
Thank you very much. Thank you.